And I apologize for the pause. These are technology breaks. Should have some kind of vintage commercials when I do this, like on WandaVision, so that, you know, you've got some kind of break when switching slides. Two things, yes, two things, three things. No, actually just two things that we'll be talking about over the next two class sessions. One of them is the political changes wrought by all of this that we've been talking about, the Reformation, the response by Roman Catholics, the wars of religion. How has this changed the landscape politically? It's very significant. And then second, how is all this changing the landscape intellectually? Because this is also the time when the movement is beginning that we now call the Enlightenment, when new ideas about knowing and how we know are beginning to make fundamental changes to European societies. First, let's talk about the two concepts of constitutionalism and absolutism. These are two very different approaches to governing that begin to develop during this period and are going to have a long, extended impact on all that is to come. Constitutionalism is the idea of divided power. It can mean a situation without a monarchy, though in the two examples I've got here, there is a monarchy still, or at least a quasi-monarchy of the Dutch Republic. But the idea is the ruler shares power with the people, and there is a balance of contending powers in a constitutional situation. Constitutional monarchy is going to develop over the 17th century in England through a variety of difficult circumstances we'll talk about more. And in the Dutch Republic, it's a thing from 1581 forward. Remember, the Dutch Republic had rebelled against Spain, and the resulting government they created was a constitutional monarchy. Essentially, the stadtholder of Orange was sort of a quasi-king, at least he was the executive of the structure. And then they had a constitutional assembly, which actually ran the country. And then we'll talk about how England ends up developing this power-sharing relationship between the monarchy and the legislative bodies in Parliament. Absolutism is a form of government where the Renaissance princehood that we talked about at the beginning of the semester is put on high-grade steroids. Absolutism is where executive power is completely concentrated, almost exclusively, in the hands of whoever the monarch is. And I've got several countries listed here that are representative of absolutist monarchy: Holy Roman Empire, Russia, eventually two big German states, Prussia and Austria. Keep your eye on Prussia and Austria. Prussia, on the one hand, is the German state that eventually is going to turn into Germany as we know it. In 1871, Prussia is going to become the actual country of Germany, and Austria is going to develop an empire of its own in the early 19th century. So keep your eye on those two. Of all those states that represent absolutist monarchy, the one that leaned into it the most, and therefore the one we're going to talk about the most, is France under Louis XIV. And of course, the degree to which they invest themselves in absolute monarchy is almost going to guarantee that sooner or later, the lid is going to blow off the pot. The tensions created by that are eventually going to prompt one of the most violent and deadly revolutions in all of Western and world history, as we'll see. Let's talk for just a moment about the situation in England. And I'm actually going to summarize. I've got a slide after this one that's got a little bit more detail that I'm going to go into about this. So let me summarize for you real quick, and then we'll jump slides for a second. Remember that Elizabeth I was one of the most successful rulers of her age. She certainly had her foibles and her imperfections, but overall, when she died in 1603, the country was said to be better off than it was when she came to power. But there is a problem at her death. Of all the things that Elizabeth addressed throughout her reign, one of the primary things that Henry VIII would have said a king is supposed to do, Elizabeth had not done. And what was that? Produce an heir. She had never gotten married, probably because she sensed that the moment she got married, some of her independence of power would be curtailed. and she didn't want that. It also may have been due to the fact that she could remember, not necessarily the death of her mother, although she knew about it, but she actually was there in the palace when Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, was arrested. She could remember the screams as Catherine was dragged off to jail. And some have said that also was part of her aversion to marriage, that the sad history of the way that her father, had handled some of his marriages put her off on the idea. So when she dies, she does not have an heir. And some people would say this is the moment when Mary, Queen of Scots, actually wins just a tiny bit of a victory, because the closest heir is Mary's son, James VI of Scotland. James is invited to ride south, and he becomes the king of both England and Scotland. 1603, this is the first time the crowns are united in modern history. They had been united back in the medieval period under England's control. Now, as William Wallace and Robert the Bruce would both want you to know, it's a Scot who is riding south to take the throne. Why? Because Scots are awesome. That's just the way it is. And so James VI rides south, and as James I becomes king of a united country. James has a very uneasy relationship with the Puritans in England because he tends to prefer a high church sort of situation. And for a while, it gets kind of dicey. There is some conflict between the two, but for the most part, they find ways to work it out. One thing James does do for the Puritans is issue a new English translation of the Bible, the famous King James Version. But because he's a jerk, he publishes it with the Apocrypha inside in the first edition. So most Protestants don't use it at first anyway. They use the Geneva Bible because they don't want those books that are approved only by Catholics. He did that just to be a jerk. He knew that Protestants didn't agree with people, Puritans in particular, with people engaging in activities on a Sunday. And that included even activities that we would call fun or recreational. And so James publishes a book of sports, which gives people pointers on the kind of activities they can engage in on Sunday if they want to engage in athletic competitions. So he's goading the Puritans constantly. And there's a little bit of competition back and forth between them to see how they can influence people the most. James is going to die in 1625. And when he dies, his son Charles is going to become king of England. And this is where things really begin to fall apart because James had his issues with the Puritans, but Charles does not get along with them at all. And to make a long story short, Charles is so going to antagonize the Puritans that in the early 1640s, they're going to take up arms against him in what is known as the English Civil Wars. This is the period when a lot of Puritans are leaving the country. Note the dates. 1620-21, Plymouth is being founded in New England. 1630 and 31, Massachusetts Bay Colony, the town that we now know as Boston, was founded by Governor Winthrop and that party of Puritans. They're leaving England because things are not good for Puritans during that period. And so in the early 1640s, they're going to rebel. Parliament, which is on the Puritan side, is going to take up arms against the king. The king is going to go so far as to hire Irish mercenaries to try to oppress his own people. And in their mind, this is absolutely a bridge too far. You don't consort with the Irish in the mind of the English. And so as the Puritans and Parliament begin to gain traction in this conflict and come closer to winning it, there's a lot of discussion about what should be done with such a traitorous king. In 1648, the king's forces are going to collapse. And when they do, Parliament is going to not only take over the country, but capture the king as well. One of the primary leaders of the parliamentary forces is a cavalry officer by the name of Oliver Cromwell. He is actually the descendant, one of the descendants of Thomas Cromwell, the guy that worked for Henry VIII. Remember the one that ticked him off so badly by marrying Anne of Cleves that he ended up getting a drunken executioner, and it took forever to basically remove his head from his shoulders. Oliver is a descendant several generations down the line, And he's considered to be one of the most significant and one of the most controversial figures in British history. I've often said that in many ways, Oliver Cromwell is the Andrew Jackson of British history. Because in the same way, Andrew Jackson really captures people's imagination in American history, and he's sort of a pretender of sort of a populism in American culture that was new. But at the same time, Andrew Jackson's very infamous for some of the things that he did and a very controversial figure. Cromwell is the same way. The English have actually put a statue of Cromwell outside Parliament that you can see today if you go to the Houses of Westminster. And some of them regard him as something of a military hero. If you go to Ireland and Scotland, they'll talk about how they think he's a genocidal maniac because he launches attacks on both those places and kills numbers of people. So he's a very controversial figure. Cromwell is one of the leading voices in Parliament. And Cromwell says, this man has attacked his own people. He is therefore a traitor to the kingdom, should be put on trial, and should be executed. And that is exactly what is going to happen in January of 1649. The King of England, Charles I, is put on trial, and ultimately he is going to be judged guilty, and he is executed on January the 30th. After making a speech, his head is cut off, and it's said that when his head is cut off, there's a collective gasp because people realize the enormity of what has just happened. And we should pause for a second to recognize it as well. It's not so much the death, which is horrible and amazing, but the thing that we should take note of is the charge under which he was executed. He is accused of committing treason against his people and his country. Now, this may be a confusing question. Hopefully it's not, but if you're accused of treason against the country, what does that mean for you as a ruler in regard to your relationship to the country? Hopefully you understand what I'm asking. If you can be accused of treason, what does it mean in regard to the nation's identity and your own? Yes, the people come first. And whereas there are some rulers that claim, I am synonymous with the state is organized around my person. What does something like this charge say about that assertion? Yes, you're subservient to the state. And there's a difference between your personhood and the entity of the state. It's something different. Louis XIV, as we're going to see, he's famous for saying in France, l'état c'est moi, which translated, I am the state is me. By accusing Charles I of treason, I'm not sure they even realize the enormity of what they're suggesting. What they're suggesting is, one, there's a difference between the body of the ruler and the concept of the state. And two, exactly as you said, the people and the state don't exist to service the ruler. The ruler exists to serve the interest of the people and to protect them. And if the ruler violates that trust, then the ruler is to be held accountable. Now, this is defining it further than they understood at that point. But it is a radical moment that a lot of people note. They look at it and say, what does this mean potentially for the very idea of kingship and of statehood? It's asserting something very radical that's going to be developed by many other writers as time goes on. Many other minds are going to take the seat of this idea that in some way the king could commit treason against his people. And they're going to start speculating about this concept. Is there a definition of a state which separates it from heredity, which separates it from aristocracy, which makes it something different than it's been defined before throughout the medieval period? It's a very horrible moment, and the English are never going to kill another king. They are going to repent of the idea that this kind of thing could be solved by bloodshed. But the ideas that have been unleashed here, they're not going to go quietly. In fact, we're going to see them germinate as the century continues. And some very interesting developments arise from it. We'll see that happen on Friday. For now, ladies and gentlemen, have a great couple of days. Stay warm, stay well. Let me know if I can do anything to assist you. Yes, sir.
Why would the Queen allow most of the Puritans to escape from the colony? Would you not notice that's just going to create diversity between the government and the colonies in the long run?
You would think so. They kind of see the colonies as a dumping ground. The one they're most worried about is Virginia. And when they first left, at least the Pilgrims, they actually planned to end up in Virginia. And they don't. They end up further north. They get blown off course, and so they're more independent than they would have been. Then for Massachusetts Bay, there's supposed to be some control in regard to the royal charters that were issued. And so they issued this charter, and Winthrop, being a lawyer, kind of thought of a way to get around it. They took the charter with them when they left so that it couldn't be legally amended, and they actually have it in Massachusetts Bay. And so the Crown is sort of stymied there for several decades. They don't know how to deal with it because they're kind of operating as a semi-autonomous colony, and the Crown really doesn't have the power to revoke the charter. They will later, towards the end of the century, they'll appoint a royal governor and all that. But for a while, they kind of have the government at a loss because they just took it with them. And they have like a company of investors that's keeping things in a very tight circle.
Yeah, I just found it because like when France came over, right? It was like you had the good things and kings come over, right?
Yes.
So I was like, well, why was there difference? But that makes sense then.
And sort of that autocratic government that France develops, it makes it easier for them to control it.
Yeah.
That is part of it. You know, they just don't have a vision for developing the colonies. The idea that, you know, you need to keep a lid on this because you may eventually want to control this more closely. It could be profitable. At first, they're very hit and miss in regard to how they're issuing charters and colonizing. They're going to, like, in order to get rid of some of the Catholic populace, they're going to grant the charter to the Calverts from Maryland. And Maryland starts off as a Catholic colony, and they're happy with that. They're sort of like, okay, well, yeah, we'll just let them go there.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Hi.
I just was wondering, so next week we have the class on Wednesday.
Yes.
I also have another test right before that, but sometimes it goes home.
Okay.
So I was wondering, is it possible to I would take this test like on a different day, on like Thursday or Friday?
Possibly. Yeah, we might could work something out there if we needed to.
Okay. Yeah, because I just wasn't sure. Because on Thursday I'll probably have like quite a bit of time. I only have one class on Thursday.
Okay. My Thursday is going to be a little interesting next week because I'm part of a committee that's interviewing candidates for theology position. So let's see. Let me think for a second. What time do you have free on Thursday?
Anytime after 11.
I think I could probably, could you do it at 11? For like that hour between 11 and 12?
Yeah, that can probably work.
I think if you could do that, that should work fine. Because I think I'll be in between meetings at that point.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll let you know if it seems like it's gonna be fine.
Okay.
But yeah, that would be great. I would appreciate it.
And also, I mean, if you wanted to just get it out of the way, it's up to you. If you wanted to come here and start it, and like say it's 2:15 or whatever time it is, 12:15 or whatever. I mean, I could let you stay in here and sit with my other class because I have a section after this too and finish up. So either way, either one of those works.
Okay.
You just let me know what you'd like to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. See ya.
See you. Have a good day.
You too.